During the next hour, I will introduce you to every single HTML element you really need to get started. If you want to make your website beautiful as well, feel free to take my full CSS course afterwards. So let's get started. Today, we'll learn what HTML is and how to set it up as fast as possible. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's a standard language that basically builds the structure of every website in the internet. You use HTML to define headings, paragraphs, links, images, and so on. So basically everything you see on a website. To write HTML, all you need is a text editor and a browser. You could basically write HTML code in a regular text editor, but since that is not very efficient, I recommend a code editor which highlights, formats, and indicates errors in the code for you. I recommend installing Visual Studio Code, and in order to do so, we are just going to type Visual Studio Code in Google, and then we click on the first link, and right here you can basically just click download for Windows, which will get you to the download windows. Then you're going to wait until you install the entire setup, and once the installation is ready, you're basically going to click on the installer. Then you basically just accept the agreement, you click next, next, install, and then you'll wait until the installation is basically done. And once we're done, we're just going to press finish. Now we can open Visual Studio Code by typing Visual Studio Code into our search bar, for example, or you can obviously just click the shortcut on your desktop. And this will open Visual Studio Code. We can maximize it here. And now we can basically go to the desired destination by pressing File, Open Folder. Now we can, for example, navigate to the desktop. And here we can create a new folder, for example, which can have the name HTML, or the name is basically up to you. And we're going to select that folder. And as you can see, we are now inside of our folder. To create an HTML file, we can now press on the new file icon and give our file a name, like index.html. The .html ending tells the browser that this file is an HTML file. And this is really important if you want to create your websites. It's a convention that you basically always name your root file, so the entry of your website, index.html. We're now going to install two extensions that are really important if you want to work with HTML. The first one is basically called Prettier, which is a code formatter. To install extensions, you are first going to navigate to the extensions tab over here. And right here in the search bar, you can type the name of the extension, which is Prettier in our case. Then we're going to press on Prettier code formatter right here. And we're going to press install. The second extension we're going to get is the live server. Again, we're going to navigate to the live server extension and we're going to press install. Now there's one additional thing we need to do to set up Prettier, so basically our code formatter. We're going to press on File, Preferences, and right here we're going to navigate to Settings. And right here we're going to type in the search bar, we're going to type Format. And right here we can select a default formatter, and it's really important that you select Prettier from the drop-down menu. So we are going to select Prettier code formatter. And the second thing we are going to do is enable format on save. And by enabling this, the code editor will make sure that the file is formatted properly every time we basically save. And you'll see what is going on here in a second. To generate a basic template in our index.html file, we are now going to use an exclamation mark and basically press enter. And this is what the basic HTML template looks like. And now if we press Ctrl S, which basically saves our file, you can see that Prettier formatted our document. To run our website, we are now going to right-click our index.html file and press Open with Live Server. This may take a second, but now you can see we basically opened our file on a website. You could also open your website without the live server by navigating into the folder where you saved your file and double-clicking your index file, for example. We'll open it up in the browser, and you can see we also have our index.html file right here. But the difference between opening the index file manually and opening it with the live server is that the live server will make sure that every time you save your file, all of the changes will be displayed live on the website, which obviously makes development a lot easier since you don't have to reopen your website every time you make a single change. So now you know what HTML is, what it is used for, and how to set up your first project. Today we'll learn the structure of an HTML file. Every HTML file follows the same basic skeleton. And here it is. Doctype HTML tells the browser this is an HTML file. HTML wraps the entire page. Inside head, you put metadata like title, styles, and scripts. Metadata is basically the information about the page that isn't shown directly, like the title, the description, or the character set, for example. Inside the body, you put the visible content of the page. Text, images, links, so basically everything the viewer sees in the end. Think of it like this. The head includes all of the information, while the body is what you actually see. So that's the basic structure of every HTML file. Today, we learned what the head in HTML is. The head is a place where you put information about your page that isn't directly shown to the user. This includes the title, the character set, and instructions for the browser. Here are the most important tags that you'll use in almost every website. The title tag sets the text in the browser tab. Meta name viewport makes the page responsive for mobile. So this is basically important to make the website look good on pretty much all devices. Meta charset UTF-8 tells the browser to use UTF-8 character encoding, which supports most languages and symbols. Computers only work with numbers, specifically with zeros and ones. A character set is needed to translate those numbers into letters and those letters into numbers, symbols, or emojis. UTF-8 is the standard today because it supports almost every language and almost every character. Those were the tags you basically need on every single website. So let's take a look at some important ones you will use pretty often. The link tag is used to connect your CSS files to your HTML file. Meta name description is important to create a description for your website and is basically the description that shows up in the Google search results. Meta name author defines the author of the page. The script tag is used to load your JavaScript files after HTML is parsed. So let's take a look at the head inside of Visual Studio Code. First of all, we can create a basic template again by using the exclamation mark and pressing enter. We're going to open the website with the live server again. And at the moment, if you take a look at the top right here, you can see that we have the text document over here. By changing the title, for example, to test title and pressing save, we can change the title on our website. And as you can see, right on the top here, we have test title now. We also have the meta tag that basically defines the char set, and we have the meta tag that defines the viewport and makes our website responsive, so that it basically looks good on mobile and pretty much every device you use. If we type meta followed by a colon, we can see the different meta tags we can use. And for example, you have UTF-8 right here. So if we just press enter, we are basically gonna generate a basic UTF-8 meta tag. We can also use meta colon description, which is basically a tag used to create a description for your website. So we can just create a basic description here by, for example, typing this is a basic description for our website, like this. We could, for example, link a style sheet by using the link tag followed by a colon and CSS, basically selecting that one from the drop-down menu, and now we collected a style sheet with the name style.css. Since we don't have the style sheet at the moment, this is not going to work. But if you want to link a CSS file to your HTML page, this would be the way to do it. And you don't have to understand what CSS is at the moment, but this is really an important concept when you really work with HTML and CSS. If you want to add an author, we can basically use the meta tag again, give it the name equals author, and then we can add the content attribute and say that the author equals Pascal, for example. Then we close the tag, and by doing so, we basically added an author to our website. You can also use the script tag to link a JavaScript file to your HTML page. You don't really need to know what JavaScript is at the moment, but just keep in mind that this is really an important concept, and you usually use a lot of JavaScript with HTML when creating a web page. To link a JavaScript file, you can basically type script :source, and by pressing enter, you'll basically have the basic template. Now you can basically define a source that could, for example, be an app.js file. We don't have this file at the moment, but we could create one by typing app.js here, for example. And now we link this app.js file to our index.html file. If we define the script tag in the head, it's important to add the defer attribute. Those were the most important things you need to know about the head in HTML. What is the body in HTML? The body is the part of an HTML page that actually shows up in the browser. Every visible element, text, images, links, buttons, forms, and so on goes inside of the body. Let's take a look at the basic structure of a body inside of HTML. If I type something inside of the body, it will show up on the web page. If we type in hello guys, for example, and save the web page, you can see it. It's displaying right here on the page. Obviously, you can display all types of elements on our website. Headings work, for example. Paragraphs work as well. Of course, you can also add links that navigate you to a different website or an image. Obviously, you don't need to know all of these tags yet, but this is basically how the body works inside of HTML. Today, we learn what HTML tags are. HTML is made of tags. A tag tells the browser what kind of element something is, like text, a heading, an image, or a link. Most tags come in pairs, an opening tag and a closing tag. The opening tag looks like this, while the closing tag looks like this. Everything in between is the content. Some tags are self-closing, which means that you close the tag within itself. This is indicated by a backslash at the end of the opening tag. If an element needs content like text inside, it's usually not self-closing. If the element just stands alone, like defining the char set for example, it's usually self-closing. Hope you understand tags now. Today, we learn what attributes are in HTML. Attributes give extra information about an element. They always go inside the opening tag. Let's take a look at an example. Right here, source tells the browser where the image file is, for example. Alt gives an alternative text if the image can't be loaded. Rule of thumb, tags define what an element is. Attributes define details about it. And this is what attributes in HTML are. Today, we'll learn headings and text in HTML. Headings go from H1 to H6, and they define titles or subtitles on a page. Let's take a look at it in VS Code. By using an opening tag for the H1 tag and a closing tag for the H1 tag, and writing something in between, we generate a title. And the title could, for example, be all you need to know about cameras. And once we save, we see we have an H1 title on the top of our page. Usually every website should only have one single H1 title, which basically represents the title of the entire page. You could also add an H2, which is basically a subtitle on your page. Let's add an H2 with the text my favorite cameras. And once we save it, you can see the H2 popping up right below our H1. As you can see, the H2 is slightly smaller than the H1, and you can have as many H2 tags as you want. We could add a second H2 right here, for example, saying the most expensive cameras. If we further want to divide the H2, we can use the H3 to create several subtitles for the H2 subtitle. We could, for example, say that the first subtitle is the Sony A7300. Then we save it and you see we have a third subtitle which basically is right below my favorite cameras. Now we might have several cameras, so we can duplicate the subtitle by pressing Shift, Alt and the down arrow. And by doing so we can, for example, duplicate it twice. Now we could maybe add the Fujifilm X-T3 and probably the Sony camcorder. And now we have three subtitles showing three different cameras. We could obviously further divide our page into H4. This is an H4. And we could further divide our H4s into H5s, of course. And finally, we could add an H6 to further divide our H5s into H6. This is an H6. You don't really use H1 to H6 for styling purposes, but to really tell the Google search engine how your website is basically structured. So your H1 should always be the title of your website and the most important, most descriptive thing to describe your website. Your H2 is then usually used to subdivide your website into subsections. H3 is used to subdivide your H2s into further subsections, the way I did it right here. And then H4, H5 and H6 obviously further to subdivide the previous title. Paragraphs, on the other hand, are written within the P tag and they're used to display blocks of text on the page. So headings basically give structure, paragraphs give content. So if we take a look at our page inside of Visual Studio Code, we would, for example, write a short paragraph about every single camera. So basically about the Sony A7300, the Fujifilm X-T3 and the Sony camcorder. So we can basically generate a paragraph by using a P tag, an opening and a closing P tag. And inside of these P tags, we basically have the text we want to display. So this could be a basic text like this, or we could also obviously use a longer text. We can create a placeholder text, for example, right here, just for demonstration. by writing lorem and then the amount of words we want to use as a placeholder text. In our case, we want to use 30 words, for example. So we'd write lorem 30, we'll press enter, and it will generate 30 words, as you can see. And now we have our paragraph below the Sony heading. Obviously, we can use multiple paragraphs on our website. So we could, for example, add a paragraph below the Fujifilm X-T3. We could add a paragraph below the Sony camcorder and so on. And by doing so, we have headings and paragraphs right now to give our website structure and content. Today, we learn all about lists in HTML. There are two main types of lists, ordered lists and unordered lists. An unordered list uses the UL tag. Each item inside of an unordered list goes inside of an LI tag. An ordered list uses the OL tag and numbers the items automatically. Here, items also go inside of an LI tag. If you need a specific order, like step 1, step 2, use an ordered list. If the order doesn't matter, like a list of ingredients, use an unordered list. So let's take a look at that inside of Visual Studio Code. First of all, we are going to start by creating an unordered list. We can do so by using the UL tag, by basically using an opening and a closing tag for the unordered list. Now we will use the LI tag to create different list items. So we can basically do so by using the LI tag, and inside of the LI tag we are basically going to use some text like this is the first item. Now we can duplicate this item 2 times, for example, and create a second item and a third item. Once we save, we can basically see those bullet points, and we have our first item, we have our second item, and we have our third item. And as you can see, you could basically add as many items as you want to. Now let's take a look at the ordered list by using an OL tag for ordered list, and again using LI to create different list items again. This could, for example, be the first ordered list item, and now we'll save our website, and as you can see, we have a 1 right here, and now it basically says this is the first ordered list item. Now we can duplicate this item again, and as you see, it now basically enumerates every single item. So you have a first item, you have a second bullet point, and a third bullet point. And we could, for example, rename this to second and third, but it doesn't really matter too much. I'm sure you basically understand the difference between ordered and unordered lists now. Every time the order of the list matters, you basically use an OL tag, and otherwise you use an UL tag. This is basically all you need to know about ordered lists and unordered lists. Today we learn what links in HTML are. Links are created within the A tag, which stands for anchor. So let's take a look at it inside of Visual Studio Code. We can create a link by using the A tag and pressing enter. As you can see, it automatically creates this href tag, which basically defines the location we are going to get once we click the link. So we could, for example, go to google.com, for example. We can copy this link and paste this link into this href tag. As you can see, it takes the full link. If we go back to our website, you basically can't see anything. So we basically need something to press on our link. So we'll add a text right here, which could basically say go to Google. Now we save our website, and now we have this link here which says go to Google. If you click this link right now, we will be redirected to Google, as you can see, but we basically want to go back. And now imagine you want to open this link in a new tab once clicking on it. And you can do so by using the target attribute, as you can see, which is equal to underline blank. And by adding target equals underline blank, you will redirect the user inside of another tab basically. So once we click on to go to Google right now, it will open a new tab, as you can see right here, and then it will redirect the user inside of the new tab to Google. And as you can see, our website is still open right now. And if we click 3 times on this link, for example, it will open 3 different tabs. If you want to navigate the user to another HTML tag, you could create a second HTML page here, for example, which could, for example, be our contact page. So we are going to name it contact.html. Now we're going to generate a basic template on this page as well. And we're just going to say contact right here, for example. And now we could, for example, generate a second anchor tag. And inside of this anchor tag, we are going to say go to contact page. We're going to save, but as you can see, if we click this link now, it basically doesn't do anything because we didn't use an href here. To navigate to another HTML page inside of the same folder, we can use the hashtag, and then we are basically just going to type the name of the page, which is contact.html. And if we want to navigate to the contact.html, we basically just have to type the name of the page, which is inside of the same folder right here, and press enter. And now by clicking on go to contact page, we will open the contact page, as you can see. And now we landed on the contact page. Obviously, we could also add the target equals underline blank attribute as well here. And if we click go to contact page, we will open a new tab now, and we will open the contact page inside of a new tab. So this is all you need to know about the anchor tag in HTML. Today, we learn about images in HTML. Images are added within the image tag. It's a self-closing tag, which means it doesn't need a closing partner. So let's take a look at it inside of VS Code. First of all, we can create an image by using the image tag. The image tag looks like this, and it has two attributes, the source attribute and the alt attribute. The source attribute is basically used to define the location of the image, while the alt attribute is used to create a fallback text in case the image can't be loaded. And it is also used for search engines to understand your content, and in case you have visually impaired users, the screen reader will basically read out the alt text. So the alt text is pretty important as well. Now let's get an image to use on our website. We can, for example, use Unsplash or download it pretty much anywhere online. We could, for example, display this image. Then we are going to press download for free. We are going to take the image once it has been downloaded, and we're going to drag it right into our folder in VS Code. So we're basically going to go here, we're going to drag it into our folder. The name is kind of weird right now, so we're going to rename the image to my image, for example. The name doesn't really matter though. And now we can basically use the source attribute to define the path to our image. And right now, the image is basically in the same folder, so we're just going to enter or just going to write the name inside of the source attribute by defining my-image.jpg. And now if we save our website, it should basically already display our image. Obviously the image is way too big, but we could change it, for example, by using the width attribute and, for example, putting this to, for example, 100 pixels or 500 pixels or whatever. But usually it's obviously not recommended to use HTML attributes for styling, and you usually use CSS for this. I just wanted to show you that this is basically the image and that you can also use the width attribute to basically rescale the image, but this is not the recommended way. And as I already mentioned, it's also important to use an alt text, so we could basically say that we have some glasses on a chair. And now, in case the image can't be loaded, we will basically have this fallback text, or if a screen reader would read out our website, it would basically read out this alt text. So this is basically all you need to know about images in HTML. Today we learn about divs and spans in HTML. Not every element in HTML has a meaning. Some are just containers. For example, div is a block level container and span is an inline container. They basically don't describe what's inside, they just group elements. Think of a classroom. The pupils inside are the elements, they're the actual content. The classroom itself is just a container grouping all those pupils together and separating one class from another. That's what a container like a div does in HTML. It doesn't have meaning by itself, but it groups elements so it can organize or style them as one unit. You can create a div by typing div, then closing a bracket, and you have an opening and a closing tag for a div. And everything inside of this div basically belongs to this div container. We can now, for example, write something inside of the div, like here is some text, and you'll see the text on the website. But this text is inside of a div right now. And we can take a look at this div inside of the inspector, which we can basically open by right-clicking the page and inspect. And those are basically developer tools. So if you basically hover over the body, it highlights basically everything that belongs to the body element. Now you can expand the body and see what is basically inside of the body. And as you can see, we have our div inside of the body right here. And now if we make our website a little bit bigger and we hover over the body, we see that basically the div is our body, so this is the entire body. Now if we hover over the div, it basically highlights the entire div, and as you can see, our div goes from left to right. So it basically takes up the entire available space, so everything from left to right. Now I want to show you a second container element, which is basically the span, and we're going to create it pretty similar to the div. The only difference is basically that the name is span. Now we can also like write something inside of the span, like here is some span text. And now we save our website and this basically reloads our website. So now if we hover over the body, it basically marks everything. So it marks our div and our span. And the reason for this is that our div and our span are basically child elements of our body. So our div and our span are inside of our body. Now we can expand our body. And if we hover over our div, it basically marks our div. And if we hover over our span, it marks our span. As you can see, our div takes up all the available space from left to right. If you see it right here, everything that is blue is basically our div. If we hover over our span, you can basically see that our span takes up the minimal available space. So it just takes up the space that is necessary to display the text. So we could, for example, create a second div element right here and say, here is a second div, and we'll save our website. And as you can see, it will display our second div below our first div. And the reason for this is that our first div takes up all the available space. We create a second div, and the second div takes up all the available space. So it obviously needs to display the second div inside of a new row because there's no space available in the first row. But if we create a second span, for example, by using the span tag again and saying here is a second span, it can display the second span right next to the first span because the first span just takes up the minimal space necessary to display the text. So there's a lot of space available right next to the first span. And basically a div is called a block level element because it is basically displayed as a block that takes up all the available space. And span is basically called an inline element because you can basically display multiple spans in line, in one single line, because they take up the minimal necessary space to display the content inside. Both of them are basically containers, just with a different purpose. And that is all you need to know about divs and spans. Today we'll learn about HTML hierarchies. HTML is structured like a family tree. Elements can contain other elements. An element that wraps another one is the parent, and the one inside is the child. This parent-child relationship is what creates the structure of every web page. So let's take a look at it inside of VS Code. First of all, we have our HTML tag that basically wraps the entire web page. So this is basically the parent element of every element inside. Now we have the head and the body, which are both direct childs to our HTML tag. If we create a new element inside of our body, we create a child to the body element. So we can, for example, create a div inside of our body, and now this div is a child of this body tag, and this body tag is a child of this HTML tag again. If we, for example, create a paragraph inside of our div, which contains some text, for example, and we save our web page, then this paragraph is a child of this div. So this div is basically the parent of this paragraph, and this paragraph is the child of this div. This div again is the child of this body, and this body again is the child of this HTML tag. Now we can create a second paragraph, and now we have one child of this div, and we have another child of this div. And now we can take a look at this inside of the inspector by right-clicking and pressing inspect. And as you can see the structure, the tree structure of this HTML document. If we hover over the HTML tag, you can see that it marks basically everything that contains to this HTML tag. So basically everything. But if we hover over the body tag, it basically highlights almost everything again, because the body includes basically all of the information, because the body is basically a parent element to pretty much all of the content. If we hover over the div tag, again, it highlights both p tags, because both of these p tags are direct children of this div. And now if we hover over the paragraph, it basically highlights the first paragraph. If we hover over the second paragraph, it basically highlights the second paragraph. Under developer tools in the element section, you can really good visualize the tree structure of every HTML document. By pressing this arrow and opening the body, you basically see all of the children of the body element. By opening the div, you basically see all of the children of the div element, and so on. And understanding this structure is really important when working with HTML. Today we learn all you need to know about semantic HTML. Usually the basic template of a web page consists of a header, a main section, and a footer. The header usually contains the head content of your website, so basically navigation bar like the nav bar. And for example, if you take a look at a company website, you oftentimes have a video or an image on the top that basically shows what the company is doing, for example. And that usually belongs in the header as well. The main section usually contains the main content, so the main information that you want to share with the user. So that could be, if you think about a blog post, that could be the blog post, for example. And then finally you have a footer on pretty much every website that includes basic information like the contact us information, a phone number, a street, a city, and so on. So all of that basically goes into the footer. Now you can further subdivide these sections with certain elements, and I'm going to introduce you to those elements. The first element that is pretty important is the nav element, which, as the name already implies, basically is the nav bar or wraps the nav bar. Inside of this nav element, we could, for example, create a nav bar now by using an unordered list, then a list item, and now inside of this list item we can create a link that, for example, points to our home page, which could be our index.html. So basically this page. Let's say that is our home page, and now we can copy this link tags and create two more nav elements, and let's say the second one goes to an about us page and the third link goes to a contact page. Obviously we didn't create those pages yet. We have a contact page, so we can create that one, but we don't have a an about us page. But usually you could obviously add an about us page as well, and then this link would redirect to the about us page, and this link would redirect to the contact page. So this is basically a nav bar, and usually the nav bar goes inside of the header. Now when it comes to the main content, if you think about like a website that basically introduces the user to cameras, for example, you could use a section, and a section is used to group related content inside of the main area. So let's imagine we have a section right here, and inside of the section we have an H2, for example, that says my favorite cameras. So this section basically groups all of my favorite cameras. So we could actually also create a second section, and the second section could, for example, include the worst cameras. So now I have one group for my favorite cameras, and now I have another group for the worst cameras, in my opinion. And in this group, I could, for example, list all of my favorite cameras. So every camera should basically go inside of an article, because an article is a self-contained piece of content, like a blog post or a post about a camera, for example. A post about one single camera or information about one single camera goes inside of an article, because it is basically a short article about one single camera, and those articles all together make up one section, because all of those articles, all of those single cameras are part of my favorite cameras. Hope that was a good explanation. So I could go here and create an article tag to group one article, and right here I could use an H3 tag, for example, and say my first favorite cameras, maybe the Fujifilm X-T3, for example. Then I could like create a short paragraph including maybe 30 words, and now I have an article that includes my first favorite camera, which is the Fujifilm X-T3, and I have a little bit of text about it. So I could go here and take this article and create a second article inside of my section, because I obviously have more than one favorite camera. So I could also have the Sony camcorder as another camera that I really like. So now I have two cameras inside of my favorite camera section, and both of these cameras go inside of an article. Now I could obviously go here and take this article and paste this article into my section, second section as well. I could change maybe the names, so this could be the X-T4, for example, and yeah, this could be whatever. It doesn't really matter. I hope you get the idea. And now you might also want to give the user the possibility to buy this camera on Amazon, for example. Maybe you're an affiliate and you want to make some money by redirecting the user to Amazon, whatsoever, it doesn't really matter. But the link does not really contain to the content, if you want to say, because the link is like not really any information that the user needs, and the information also does not really belong to the content. So it's more or less something that is aside from the content. So here you can use the aside tag, because this is like site information, like sidebar or related links, as you can see. So we can use the aside tag right here, and inside of this aside tag we can, for example, create a link, and this link redirects wherever, and in our case we say get the Fujifilm X-T3, for example. And now we have a link right here where we could click basically on, maybe get redirected to Amazon or wherever, and buy the Fujifilm X-T3. So this is basically the purpose of the aside tag. Now let's get to the footer, which is usually on the bottom of your web page and usually contains links to, for example, a contact form, or includes copyright information or a phone number whatsoever. So we could, for example, create a paragraph here, say add copyright 2K25, then we could add a phone number, say phone : +49176, doesn't really matter, and so on. So we can like create content that basically usually goes in the footer, that does not really belong to the main content and does also not belong into the header. So basically just some site information that some people might need, but content that does not really belong to the main content and is not really necessary for the purpose of the page, to be honest. And this is the basic structure of every web page if you work with HTML. Let's learn about inputs in HTML. The first input I want to show you is the text input. You can create an input by using the input element, and then you can use the type attribute to define a certain type. And as you can see, we have a lot of different types right here. And to create a text input field, we basically select the text input type. And once we save, we basically have our input field right here, where we can type basic text. If you want to indicate what the input is used for, you can use a placeholder to show the user a certain text, like username, for example. And now once we save the website, we see that the user basically sees username right here. So this indicates to the user that this field is probably used to create a username. So I could, for example, create my username right here now. For a lot of inputs, you also want to use an ID field like username and a name field like username. Those two attributes are especially important when you work with JavaScript and CSS. Creating a password works pretty similar by creating an input field and using a type of password. As you can see, if we type something inside of the password field, it is now hidden. Again, we can use the placeholder field as well here, and those attributes work pretty much for most input fields. A tip if you work inside of Visual Studio Code is that you can basically type the name of the tag, which is input, followed by a colon, and then the type of the input field you want to use. Let's say we want to use an email input field. By using colon email and pressing enter, you basically auto-generate a basic template for an email field. Now you could enter a name, which could be email, and an ID, which could be email, for example. Once we save, we have an input field for our email, which could be heyo@gmail.com. To create an input field for a number, we can create an input field again with the type of number. And for the number input field, we can also define a min value, which could be 0, and a max value, which could be 100, for example. And as you can see, if we type like 90 inside of this input field and we are like going upwards, we can just go up to 100. And the same obviously goes in the opposite direction. To create a checkbox, we can again create an input field of type checkbox. And we can, for example, give the checkbox a name of is broke and an ID of is broke. And once we save, we basically have our checkbox right here, which we can check and uncheck. The checkbox also has a checked attribute, and once we save, you can see our checkbox is checked. And if we uncheck it and save our file, our checkbox is basically checked again. So this checked attribute basically makes sure that the website, once it loads, has a checkbox that is already checked. Radio buttons are pretty similar to a checkbox, but it's probably easier to understand if I just show it to you. Like this, we have a radio button, and we can, for example, create 3 different radio buttons right here, and we can check every single radio button. But if we use the same name for each radio button, like has pants, and now we just copy this name and paste it into all of the 3 radio buttons, we can check one radio button, we can try to check the second one, but as you can see, Once we check the first radio button, it unchecks the second radio button. So this name attribute basically allows you to connect different radio buttons and makes sure that you are just able to select one single radio button. And this is really good if you want to make sure that the user has to choose between different options, for example, and is just able to choose one single option. To create an input field that allows the user to select the date, we can use the date type. And once we save, we basically have this date picker where the user can open a date form, if you want to say it like that, and select a desired date, for example. You can also give the user the option to upload a file by using the file input field. And once you save the code and update your HTML file, you have the option to choose a file from here. And this gives you the option to upload an image, for example, or whatever. Usually when working with input fields, you use them inside of a form most of the time, and every form needs to have the option to submit the form to a server, for example. So if you think about Facebook, you type in your username, you type in your password, and then you press a button. And this button allows you to register, to log in, whatsoever. And this button is basically the submit button. So this button tells the browser to submit the form to a server. And to create this button, you can use an input field as well, because in the end, a button press is just an input that the user gives. And you can create that input field by using input:submit. And this will create an input field of type submit. And you can create a value, which could be register, for example. The value is just the text of the button. And if you click register, you would submit the form to a server if all of this was inside of a form, which it isn't right now, but usually you use this input field inside of a form to submit a form. And something that you use oftentimes in combination with the input fields is the label, and the label allows you to create a text that is connected to a certain input field. So imagine we have an input of type text that allows you to type in a gamer tag, for example. So you have this input field that allows you to type in a gamer tag, and now you want to create a label, and this label should be connected to this gamer tag. So we can, for example, write a text inside of this label, which could also be write your gamer tag, for example, or write your username, whatsoever. And once we click this text, nothing is going to happen because this label is not yet connected to our gamer tag input field. And to connect your label to your input field, you need to create an ID, and that ID can, for example, be gamer tag or whatever. The ID is something you can choose as you want. The only important thing is that this for tag matches the ID of the input field you want to connect your label to. So in our case, it has to be gamer tag as well. And once we save, we can now click our label basically, and it will highlight or select our input field, and we can just write inside of our input field without having to select the input field separately. And this is all you need to know about inputs in HTML. Today we learn all you need to know about HTML forms. You can create an HTML form by using the form tag. You have an opening and a closing tag, and the form usually an important attributes when working with forms is the action attribute and the method attribute. The action is really important when working with a server or PHP, for example. So the action attribute basically tells where to send this form. So if you basically have a PHP script, you tell that this form will basically be sent to this PHP script, and then this PHP script, for example, would define how to work with the form data. So this is not that important for us right now, but it's important to know once you start working with a server. The method basically defines how you send the data you send via this form. And there are basically two ways to send your data. You can use the get method or you can use the post method. If you use the get method right here, your data will basically be appended to your URL and everyone can see it. And if you imagine you have a form with, for example, a username and a password, and you append this username and the password to your URL, it's probably not the best idea because this would definitely not be secure, and if anyone would read out your URL or stuff like that, he would be able to get access to your username and your password, which obviously isn't something you want to do. So if you want to use a secure way to send your data, you always use the post method. And by using the post method, your data which you send to the server is basically encrypted. So if you have important data like a credit card number, a password, whatsoever, always make sure to use the post method. When do you even use the get method? method. So the get method is really good if you have like websites where you have parameters like the colors of shoes and so on. So imagine you're browsing on an online store website and there are different colors. You could basically take the color the user selected, save that color in the URL, for example. The user can copy the link, for example, and if he uses the same link to get to the same website later on, he has already pre-selected the certain color. So the get method is really useful if you want to bookmark a page, for example, and pre-select certain filters, for example. Inside of this form, you can use as many input fields as you want. We can, for example, use a text input field that could have the name username and the ID of username. Let's take a placeholder of username and say that this input field basically receives the username. Now let's add a second input field that, for example, takes a password as well. We add a name of password and an ID of password again, and a placeholder of password, for example. So now we accept a username and a password. Imagine this is a register form. You will obviously also need a button to submit this register form, so the username and the password, to a server, for example. And we can create this submit button by using an input field of type submit. And now we can create a value, which could, for example, be register. And once we save, we have this register button right here. And this value is basically the text that you see over here. And every time you use a form where you want to submit data to a server, for example, you need an input field of type submit, or a button that basically submits your data to the server. And once you have this submit button, and once I click on this register button, but since we didn't really define a location to submit this file to, we are basically getting this error page. And as I already mentioned, you'll usually have a PHP file, for example, where you redirect to. So we could, for example, say, okay, we get to the index.php file, for example, once we submit this form. And now we can like reload this, but obviously we don't have this index.php file, so we get an error. But this is basically the way forms work in HTML. As you can see, if we use the get method right here and we type in a username like hello and a password of monkey, and then we press register, you can see that we basically have this URL now, which has a username, which equals hello, and a password, which equals monkey. And imagine you have a friend and you want to share a link with him, and you basically just copy this, and you have your password and your username basically saved in here. You send it to your friend would see your password and your username, which would obviously be like really risky, not a secure site, and nothing you ever want to do. So in this case, you could, as I mentioned, use the post method. And now if we use the post method right here and we type in a username and a password and press register, there's nothing saved inside of our URL. Inside of a form, you can use the field set tag to group certain elements to a logical group, basically. So we can, for example, copy this, use the field set tag, and inside of this field set tag, we'll save our username and our password. Now let's go to the bottom and we'll reload our page. And as you can see, we basically have this group of username and password right now. We could, for example, create a second field set, and we could say that we'll add an input of type text right here, and we'll accept a gamer tag right here with an ID of gamer tag again, and a placeholder of gamer tag, for example. And now we have this second field, so this second group basically, that could, for example, group game related information. And by doing so, you can basically create different subgroups inside of a form. Inside of this field set, you can use a legend if you want to do so. And inside of this legend, you could create a description for this group. So this could, for example, be gamer information, if you want to say so. And now you have this gamer information inserted into this group. And you could create a second legend for your general user information, for example, and name this user information. So now you would basically have two groups, one group that contains all of the user information and one group that contains all of the gamer information inside of one form. Now I want to go over certain attributes that are really important when working with forms, and one of them is basically the placeholder. We've already seen the placeholder just gives you a hint text basically that shows you what this input field is used for. You can also add the required field. If you add the required field to your form and press register now, it will give you a warning saying that you have to fill out this field. By using the value attribute for a field, you can create a predefined value that will show up to the user once he loads the page. So you could, for example, say I am a user. And once I load the page, you can see that our username field is basically pre-populated with the value. If we create a check mark, for example, so a checkbox by using input checkbox, we have the checked attribute, which says that the field should basically be checked once the page is loaded. So once the user gets on the page, the checkbox is already checked when using the checked attribute. And this is all you need to know to understand forms in HTML. Today we'll understand the text area in HTML. To create a text area, you can use the text area tag. Feel free to create a name attribute and an ID attribute. In our case, we'll use message for the name and for the ID. You can also have a placeholder text for every text area, which could say message, for example, as well. In addition to that, you can define the number of columns for every row. So we could, for example, say that we want 50 columns for every single row. And as you can see, our message field gets a little bit wider now. Now we can also define the number of rows by using the rows attribute, and we could, for example, say that we want to use 10 rows in total for our text area. In addition, we can define a max length to define the maximum number of characters the user can enter into this input field, basically. So if we say 10 characters is our max length, for example, we can, for example, type numbers from 1 to 9, and the 11th number will not work anymore, as you can see. If we create a longer text input field by using a max length of 100, for example, we can now save that file and we can type in a lot more characters if we want to. And this is all you need to know about the text area in HTML. Today we learn how to do a drop-down menu in HTML. To create a drop-down menu, we use the select tag, and now we can fill out the name and the ID attribute for the select element. Imagine we want to have a list of fruits, for example. Then we can use fruits for the name attribute, for example, and fruits for the ID attribute, for example. And now to create different subgroups inside of the select element, we could create an opt group by using the opt group tag, and inside of this opt group tag we can create different selectable elements by using the option tag. And inside of this option tag we can choose a value like banana, for example, and then we can decide what text the user should basically see once he opens the drop-down menu. And in our case we want to display banana to the user, and once we save our website we can already see that we have this drop-down menu which only has one single item, which is a banana basically right now. So imagine we want to have maybe a second item inside of this option group. Then we can create a second option tag, and maybe we can use the name apple for this one, and we want to create an apple option. And once we save, we now have the banana option and the apple option. Now we might have a second option group which maybe includes different elements, like let's say we want to have melons inside of the second option group. So we can say we'll have a honey melon, which is the value basically. And we use honey melon for the text. And now we have two option groups, as you can see here. One for the banana and the apple, and the second one for the honey melon. And as you can see, they are separated within the drop-down menu. Now we could, for example, create a second melon type like the watermelon. By doing so. And now we replace the honey with the watermelon. And once we save our web page, we now have the watermelon as well. And this is all you need to know about the select statement in HTML. Let's learn all you need to know about buttons in HTML. You can create a button by using the button tag. Inside of the button tag, you can define the text that you want to display on the button. So it could be, for example, a register button. Now you can click this button, but nothing is happening right now. To define a certain type for a button, you use the type attribute, and now you can, for example, create a button of type button, a button of type reset, or a button of type submit. So let's create a button of type submit in this case. To really use the submit button, you have to use this button inside of the form. So let's do that. We're going to create a form by using the form tag, and we will use the get method in this case, but this doesn't really matter in our case. So let's take the button and put it inside of our form. And once we click on the submit button inside of the form, we will submit our form. And now you will see the difference. Once we click the button, you can see that it reloads the document right on the top. And if we define an action attribute that basically tells our form where to send the data, and now pressing the button, it basically redirects us to our index.php, which does not exist on our page, but as you can see, the form is basically working. We could also create a button of type reset, for example, and if we click this button right now and rename it to reset, you can see that basically nothing is happening because we don't have any input elements in our form yet. But we could change it by creating a text element, for example, and say that this is the text element for a username. So we give it a placeholder text of type or of username as well. And now we can basically enter some text right here. And if we press the reset button, it will reset the entire values inside of our form. You can also execute a JavaScript function by using the onClick attribute inside of HTML. But this will be further discussed inside of my JavaScript course. So this is all you need to know about buttons in HTML. To create a video in HTML, we can use the video tag. The video tag has a source attribute that allows you to define the location of your video. So first of all, we obviously need to get a video. So to get a video, we go to Pexels, and on the website, we can basically select videos. We have 13 videos here. We are just going to download the first one. Doesn't really matter which one though, since we are just going to test this. We press the download button, and once the video is downloaded, we can take the video and drag it into our folder. We can now rename it to make it easier to get the path, basically. We can, for example, say this is a street.mp4. Now we close this video. We could also preview the video right here if we wanted to. And inside of our HTML file, we have to define the path to our video. So we could either go and copy the path, or we could just type in street.mp4 since we are in the same folder right now. And once we do so, we should already be able to see the video on our web page. So you basically see it's as easy as that. To embed a video, but like this, it obviously doesn't make too much sense because the video is too big. The user can't really play the video because you see it right now, it's just an image, and so on. So the first thing we can add is basically the controls attribute, which would add some controls to the video. So now the user could press the play and the pause button. Since we might not like the width of the video, we could also add the width attribute and say that we want to use 500 pixels, for example. So as you can see, the video is a lot smaller right now. We could also define a height, but this doesn't make too much sense in my opinion, because the height usually automatically adapts to the width, and by changing the height, you would basically destroy the aspect ratio. If you would, for example, say that the height is, for example, 700, you can see that this looks pretty weird. But yeah, I just want to make sure that you know that this would work as well. Now, if we load the website, the video is basically not playing at all. So the user first has to click on the play button, and then he can click on the pause button, which might be the way you want it to be. But sometimes you might want to use the autoplay option to immediately start to play the video once the user lands on the page. And as you can see, now the video immediately starts. And this oftentimes happens if you think about the website when you have like a header on the top without the controls attribute. And now once the user lands on the page, he basically has a video that is basically the header and, for example, shows what a company is doing and so on. So yeah, that might be a use case where autoplay might be really useful. We could also add the loop attribute, which just makes the video loop. So if we go to the end of the video, for example, and we'll wait until it's over, it basically just restarts again. We could add the muted attribute if we want to mute the video, but since this video does not have any sound anyways, this doesn't really matter. But once we remove the muted attribute, you can see that we have this speaker right here, and once we add the muted attribute, you can see that we have this muted speaker right here. You could also create a poster, so basically a thumbnail, a preview image, however you want to call it, by using the poster attribute, and now define the poster you want to use. And we have this image basically inside of our folder that has the name image.png. So we could basically use that as a preview image. And now if I'm going to remove the autoplay, we should just see our preview poster basically, which yeah, looks terrible in this case, but this is something you could basically do. I'm going to remove it because I prefer the normal way. So the last attribute that I want to show you that you'll probably not use that often is the preload attribute, but you have 3 different options for preloading your video, which basically means once the user gets on the page, how should the browser load the video. If you use auto, the browser will automatically decide whether he preloads the video or whether he does not preload the video. If you use metadata, the browser will just preload metadata for the video. And if you choose none, the browser will basically not preload anything. And if you preload data, this basically means that once the user gets to the video is preloaded to a certain extent already, and this obviously means that the user will be able to see the video faster, but this also means that the user will use more data to load this video. If your website is mainly being displayed on a phone, you can imagine that this would take a lot of mobile data to preload the videos, and in that case it might not make too much sense to get the browser to preload the video. But in our case, we just put this to auto, for example, and yeah. And this is all you need to know about videos in HTML. Today, we learn about absolute and relative paths in HTML. First of all, to understand what a path is, we use the image tag, because this really gives us the chance to understand them. And if I'm in the index.html file right now, I need to define the path to my image.png to display an image. So I can, in this case, just say, okay, the image is in the image folder and this will display the image basically. Now, what would happen if I would actually create a new folder and say that this is my images folder, and I'll drag my image inside of the images folder. Now I have this image in the images folder, and now we are not seeing the image anymore because the image tag can't find the image at this location. So we need to define a location. And if you think about a website, it's basically structured like a normal folder on your PC. And you can navigate within your folder, you can go into a folder, you can go backwards, and so on. And you can do the same when writing code, but it looks a little bit different. So just think about a normal folder, but you have to navigate through the folder with code basically. It makes it a lot easier if you just think about this in terms of normal folders. Now, if we want to get our image, previously our image tag was in the same folder as our index.html, so the file we are basically editing right now. So if the image is in the same folder like the index.html or the file you're editing at this time, you can just use the name of the file, because it's obviously in the same folder, so you can just say image.png, but it's not in the same folder. So how do we get into the folder? As you already saw, we can just type images, because that is the path to our images folder. And by going into images, or by writing images / we go into our images folder. And now that we are inside of our images folder, we can see all of the content that is inside of our images folder. So we can basically select our image.png. And by doing so, you'll see we have the image right here again. But what would actually happen if we would create a new folder that says, for example, HTML files. And now I'll drag my index.html into my HTML files folder. Now, to get to my images folder, I first of all need to get back up into my HTML folder. And then from the HTML folder, I need to get into my images folder. And here inside of my images folder, I need to select my image.png. So I'm inside of the HTML files folder right now because I'm inside of my index.html. So I go one step up and then I go into the images folder. And I can go one step up by using // and by doing so, we now went one folder up, so one step up. Now we are inside of the HTML folder. Inside of the HTML folder, I can now select my images folder by using images /, and by doing so, I go into the images folder again. Now that I'm inside of the images folder, I can select my image.png file. And by doing so, we should see our image.png, but we are actually not, because we didn't open our index.html with the live server at the right location. But as you can see, once we reopen with the live server, it now has the right location as well, right here, because now our index.html is inside of HTML files / index.html. So we needed to reopen that file, and now it displays our image once again. Now the thing that I explained to you is a relative path, because we are thinking in a way that is relative to the folder we are working in right now. So the path we defined here is relative to our index.html file, so the file we are working on right now. There also exists the option to define an absolute path. Now let's define an absolute path. If we use an absolute path, we always think as if we start from the root folder of the project. And as you can see, we right now opened the HTML folder. So HTML is basically the root folder of our project, and everything else is inside of this root folder. So HTML files is a folder inside of the root folder HTML. Images is a subfolder of HTML, and so on. App.js is a file inside of the HTML folder whatsoever. And to start from an absolute path, you just use a slash in the beginning. And as you can see, it shows already in the code editor everything that is basically inside of our root folder. Inside of our root folder, we have the app.js, we have the content.html, we have the HTML files, and so on. So if we want to get into images, we basically use a slash, images, slash, and by doing so we are going into the images folder. And now we select our image.png and we have our image right here once again. So there are two options to navigate in HTML. You can use absolute paths and you can use relative paths. When using a relative path, you always define the location of something relative to the file you're currently working on. If you use an absolute path, you always think as if you're working or starting from the root directory, and everything else works exactly the same. Navigating works the same. If you use // for example, you go one folder up. If you use images slash, for example, you navigate into the folder, or let's just say folder slash, so just the folder name and then a slash, you navigate into the folder, and so on. And that is all you need to know about relative and absolute paths in HTML. What is a comment in HTML? A comment is a piece of code that will not be executed. So it is basically just an information that you use for yourself or for other developers. I can create a comment by using this kind of syntax. And everything that goes in between those two lines, in between those two code blocks basically, is a comment and will not be executed. So I can basically just use whatever. I can, for example, write some basic information about this page. And if I save this file, you can see that you can't see anything. And the reason for this is that the code will not be executed in here. So you could basically give some information for another developer or for yourself inside of this code block. Maybe you want to have some more information down here and maybe some more information down here. And this is like really helpful about comments because you can organize and structure your code, get some extra information and so on. And this is all you need to know about comments in HTML.